So welcome everyone, welcome MLE Friends to this first MLE Friends talk of the fall season 2022. We're so delighted to have Dr. Marieke van Vugt with us, who's an association and board member of Mind and Life Europe. So she'll be offering the keynote talk this evening. And as you know, the MLE Friends series is an exclusive webinar series for the MLE Friends subscriber community. So welcome to all the friends this evening, and thanks for being a part of this community. So I'll just briefly introduce Marieke, and then she'll have the floor to offer her talk for about 45 minutes, and we'll have time at the end for questions and discussion. So as she's talking, you can start already thinking about questions you might have or other things you'd like to discuss during the Q&A session, and you can either put them in the chat or raise your hand at the time when we start the discussion. And our managing director, who's here tonight, Gabor Karsai, will be moderating the Q&A and discussion period at that time. So Marieke van Vugt is an associate professor at the Institute of Artificial Intelligence and Cognitive Engineering of the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. The research in Dr. van Vugt's lab focuses on how, when, and why we mind wander, and what the fundamental cognitive operations are that underlie meditation and mindfulness. Most recently, she started to investigate how analytical meditation practiced by Tibetan monks and nuns affects cognition and emotion. She addresses these questions using a combination of computational modeling, neuroscience, and experimental psychology tools. And she very much enjoys projects where science, art, and specifically classical ballet and contemplation merge and meet. And we can also offer a link to her blog at some point during the talk as well, where she writes about many of these fascinating intersections. So thank you so much, Marieke, and we will pass the baton to you now for your talk this evening about how to work with a sticky mind.
Thank you so much, Johanna, for that kind introduction. I'm only a lowly assistant professor, though, not quite yet associate, but thanks anyway. So I'm gonna start by sharing my screen, and maybe some of this talk will be a little bit technical. If I'm not making sense, if you have any questions, feel free to just also pop something in the chat or raise your hands so I can clarify, or even if you have your video on, look puzzled. I'll try to notice that. I have you guys all on the gallery view. And in the discussion, I'm both happy to go into more of the scientific details, as well as go into a much broader discussion about these sort of general topics, because as Johanna so kindly said, I'm fascinated by the whole intersection of all these topics of science and contemplative practice and arts. So. Cool. Let me get started. So the title of my talk is about how to work with a sticky mind. And I chose this title because really the work in my lab in the past couple of years has really been about thinking about the sticky mind, which has really come from my own experience of meditation. So I started researching meditation as a PhD student many years ago. And then at that time, we focused a lot on attention and working memory. But then I felt that in my own practice of meditation, really attention and working memory weren't probably really changing all that much. I mean, it made sense from a theoretical perspective, since the meditation instructions talk all about attention to start there. But then I felt actually that in my own experience, something else was changing, and something that seemed to be changing more was something that I now call the stickiness of my mind, like how much it grabs you and pulls you in one direction or the other. So in the past couple of years, I've really been thinking about, is there a way I can quantify the stickiness of the mind in the lab? So I will be sharing some of my experiments with that with you today, and it's of course just an attempt to take a very rich experience and then in a way, dumb it down in the lab so that we can actually put a number on it. But that's my business. So yeah, there we go. That's the rough idea. So before I get into all of that, of course, I'm going to be presenting really stuff that was done by mostly my students. So these are the top 4 are PhD students, and this is a very smart master student have been working on this project with me together. So today, my talk is going to consist of 3 parts. The first one is going to talk about sticky thinking. And to get there, I'll also say a little bit about mind wandering and how we measure mind wandering in the lab, because I think sticky thinking is just one specific type of mind wandering. Then secondly, I'm going to talk about how we can track this sticky thinking in the lab using measures such as EEG and also eye tracking. And then finally, the slightly more speculative part of this talk is going to be about emerging work that I'm doing and that I'm contemplating about doing about how contemplative practices can reduce sticky thinking. So there we go. This is always a good chance to show a ballet picture of me. This is me in the beautiful city of Groningen, where I live, which doesn't look as sunny today, but sometimes it looks sunny, and then you can dance outside and look kind of dreamy, kind of daydreamy. We mind wander about half of the time. So that's okay. That's one important thing to say. So some people are surprised that you might wonder about half of the time and might get really worried, but in fact, it's a really healthy part of human life. The only problem is that sometimes it becomes problematic, and I think it becomes problematic when the mind wandering becomes sticky. So before we go into stickiness, let's actually talk about mind wandering in general. So in the science of mind wandering, I mean with that mostly the cognitive neuroscience of mind wandering, there is not really the singular definition. It's been referred to as task-unrelated thinking, as self-related thought, or stimulus-independent thoughts, but no definition as singular acceptance. What I find much more useful to think about is how we can measure it in the lab. Which is the following. You do any task, typically a very boring task, because that's what psychologists and cognitive scientists do in the lab. They give people really boring tasks. But then you do one specific thing that makes it a mind-wandering experiment, which is that you insert thought probes, as they're called. So they are probes of the thoughts. And basically, those are self-report questions that you ask about every 30 to 90 seconds. I mean, you can't ask it too often, because then the person will never get the chance to mind wander. You can't ask it too little, because then you have too little data to draw any conclusions, or the person would need to be in your task for hours, which is also not too nice. So every 30 to 90 seconds is a decent compromise. And then you ask them, really, what were you thinking about just now when I asked you that question? And I think that's really critical, because there have been studies of mind wandering before, but then they would ask so before this recent field of mind wandering started, which is probably maybe around 2010 or so is when it kicked off. And what they did before was they asked people about how often in general do you mind wander. Now, obviously, people are pretty bad at remembering that. But here what we do is we ask them, well, just now, when I ask you the question, what happens? And then, if you do this every minute or so on average, and you do that for an hour, you get 60 observations. So that's a pretty decent map of the kind of task unrelated thought that happens. And then this is where you can get these numbers of how people are mind wandering about half of the time. You can give them multiple choice questions. So a common one is, people can choose, I'm thinking about the task, or how I was doing on the task, or external stimuli, or daydreaming, or I was completely blank. That's of course also possible. You can also ask them about other things about their thoughts. For example, whether it was directed to the past and present and future, whether it was about themselves or about something else. And the critical thing that I added was the stickiness question, as I like to say, which is whether it was difficult to disengage from or easy to disengage from. So a sticky thought is one that's difficult to disengage from, whereas a non-sticky thought is easy to disengage from. And that, therefore, when you're in non-sticky thought, your mind is much more flexible because you can just go somewhere else. So before I go into showing you some data that this stickiness question makes some sense, let's first show some more general data about the mind wandering. But before we do that, let's actually try this out ourselves, because I think it's always better to have first-person experience of such situations than to just tell you about it. So this is a task. In a second, you're going to see letters on the center of the screen. Some of them are going to be O's and some of them are going to be Q's. And your job is to press a button. I mean, well, you can pretend to press a button whenever it's an O, and withhold your response whenever it's a Q. And then at some point also there's going to be this self-report question about your thoughts. You ready? Okay, so let's do it. Put your finger on the button and press as quickly and as accurately as you can whenever you see an O, and do not press when you see a Q. Okay, there we go. O. There's another one. Q. So here, hopefully you haven't pressed the button. What were you thinking about? Were you thinking about the task, your performance on the task? Were you distracted by the environment? Were you daydreaming, or maybe completely blanking? So can you imagine you do this for like an hour, repeat this over and over again. So there will be plenty of opportunities for mind wandering. So it's a very effective task for that. And we get some really interesting data showing us at what points people get distracted, and what happens if you also record their brain activity. We can find out what happens in your brain at those points. And if you measure their eye, their pupil size, for example, or you track where they're looking, you see differences in where they're looking between when they're mind wandering and on task. So this is it's a very simple task, but it can provide you with very rich data. And then you can get some observations like the following. So you tend to find that task performance declines when people report they're not thinking about the task. So they have lower accuracy. That's what we see in this graph on the left. So this is the accuracy difference of mind wandering minus on task. So you can see that the accuracy is lower during mind wandering than during on task. You can also see the direction of these changes depends a little bit exactly on what kind of task you have. So the one we just did is called a SART, a sustained attention to response task. And there, what tends to happen is that people tend to speed up because you just get into this rhythm of pressing a button. There's another task that we use. It's a visual search task where you really need to pay attention and look for something in a picture. And there actually people tend to become slower. In both cases, they tend to also become more variable. So you tend to see clear changes in behavior. Sometimes though, again, I just want to emphasize mind wandering is not all that bad because it's actually pretty important for creativity. So there have been studies of that. I'm not going to go into that. And also planning, we have done some work on that. So mind wandering is not always bad. And if you don't mind wander, then please start to worry because it's really important for us as humans. But in this case, we're going to go really a little bit further into investigating when is mind wandering not good. And that's when it becomes sticky. At least that is my thesis that I want to put forward for this talk. So as I said, stickiness in the lab we measure by asking how difficult was it to disengage from the thoughts. And people are pretty well able to quantify how difficult they find it to disengage from the thought, which you can conclude from data like the following. Here we see, for example, that very specifically the variability and the response time changes depending on how sticky the thought is. So if people think their thoughts are very sticky, their responses also become very variable, which indicates generally that people are not too engaged with the task. They also tend to be mind-wandering when they say the thoughts are sticky. We will also later see that there are specific changes in their EEG as well as in their pupil size, as if they are more disconnected from the world. So sticky thinking can be measured by asking how difficult it was to disengage from the thoughts. And why is this important? Well, I think stickiness is a mild version of some really maladaptive process that's called rumination. So rumination is a process of narrowly focused, uncontrolled, repetitive thinking that's mostly negative and self-referential. And here you can also see a nice picture from a study or a review by Igor Marchetti, who suggested that rumination lies at the core of depression, and he sort of classifies it also as a form of maladaptive daydreaming. So you have adaptive daydreaming, which is also really helpful for planning and creativity, as I mentioned. But maladaptive daydreaming is associated with rumination, hopelessness, a low self-esteem, cognitive reactivity, and eventually depressive symptoms. So this is where the problem is. So if we can know already where the mind gets sticky, then we might prevent it from the stickiness getting out of hand, becoming full-blown rumination, and eventually ending up in a depression. So this is why I'm so interested in this. So that's sticky thinking. And that's why it's important. So now let's move on to how do we track sticky thinking? Again, to talk about tracking sticky thinking, I'm going to start with tracking mind wandering more generally. And in my lab, we do that by means of EEG. So EEG is you put electrodes on somebody's head, like in this picture, and that measures the very weak electrical currents that are measurable on the outside of the head, which reflect electrical activity from inside the brain. And the reason that it's a very good idea to measure such brain waves is that people do not mind wander on command. And it's hard to know when they're mind wandering. I mean, as we just talked about, you cannot ask them like all the time, because that gets really, really annoying. And also then people don't get a chance to even start mind wandering. So this is why we use EEG recording. And the way this works in general is the following. So you have a task, which is now for convenience represented as pictures of the screens that participants see. So this is a version of the same task that we did together at the beginning of my talk, but now it's a slightly different version. So we saw screens with O's and Q's, and now they're replaced by words where sometimes the word is a lowercase and sometimes it's an uppercase. And the participant has to press a button whenever it's a lowercase, like T and catch, but they have to withhold their response whenever it's a uppercase. And every so often we do again this thought probe question where we ask them, were you thinking about a task or something else? So, do this task. And by the way, what happened in this task also is that it's quite slow. You experienced this probably too. Like there's about 2 seconds on average between every subsequent stimulus. So again, gives you plenty of time to mind wander. Now, when people give responses to this thought probe, they either say I was essentially paying attention to the task, or they say I was mind wandering. Or if we ask them about the stickiness, they might say my thought was quite sticky, or it was not so sticky. So then what we can do is we can retrospectively label all the words that, or a couple of the words that were before that question, because probably, you know, at this moment we know they were maybe not paying attention to the task, but probably about 15 seconds before that, they were also still not paying attention to the task. So we label these trials then as not paying attention to the task. And then we can also label the corresponding EEG signals as not paying attention to the task. And if they say I was paying attention to the task, then we label the EEG signal as paying attention to the task. And we can also do this in a different task. I'm not going to bother you with that different task. But anyway, it's the principle is the same. We ask people whether they're paying attention, and then we label the EEG. And then we have many examples of what EEG of a focused brain, of a not mind-wandering brain looks like, and EEG of what a mind-wandering brain looks like. And then we actually feed that to a machine learning classifier. The advantage of machine learning classifiers is that they can learn patterns. So they can learn what a brain looks like when a person is mind-wandering, and they can learn what a brain looks like when a person is not mind-wandering. So we give them many examples of these two classes. And then it learns the mapping between the EEG activity and the class. And in this case, we use a machine learner that's called a support vector machine. Don't worry if you're not familiar with that. It's just a particular type of classifier that can learn these patterns. And it tries to find the examples that best distinguish between the two. And then we test, once we've taught the classifier like what a mind-wandering brain looks like and what a on-task brain looks like, we give it new data, and then we test whether it makes the correct predictions. And if it makes the correct predictions, then we can even give it other kind of data. We can know at essentially every moment in time where we have EEG data, whether the person is mind-wandering or on task. So that's the idea. So we learn from the data where we know the answer because the person has told us whether they're mind-wandering or on task. We learn, what these different brain states look like, and then we test them on other kind of data. And this is what we found. Essentially, the summary of this slide is, it's hard to learn for a computer to learn what a mind-wandering brain looks like and what a on-task brain looks like. So this is the prediction accuracy of the classifier, where this red line is 50%. So that means the classifier is at chance, so it hasn't learned anything. Every set of bars belongs to one participant. So you can also see that sometimes the accuracy was closer to 1, so was better for some participants. For some participants, it was just hopeless. They were very close to chance all the time. However, the good news is that if you combine it across all these participants, we were above chance, just slightly, like 60-something percent, 65% or so. But the computer was able to learn to some extent from the brainwaves whether the person was paying attention to the task or whether they were mind-wandering. And I'm not going to bother with these different kind of colors. Don't worry, there. You can ask me later about it. But the essence is just that the computer was able to learn it, and it was actually using the signals in the alpha band. So the alpha brainwaves, they are from 9 to 14 hertz. That was mostly the signal it was using. So here, the higher the accuracy associated with a particular part of the signal, the more the computer uses it. So you can see here, the whole model is almost 65%. But if we just feed it alpha in the green electrodes and alpha in the red electrodes, then it almost gets as good. And also an EEG signal called the P3 was quite good as well, the P3 in this blue electrode. So alpha oscillations are quite helpful to know whether somebody is mind wandering or distracted. How do we do with stickiness? If we do the same trick, but now replace mind wandering versus on task with sticky versus not sticky, how would we do? Well, actually, the answer is, and I didn't put this on a slide because the answer is that the brain actually you get a pretty similar answer when you do this with stickiness, but interestingly enough, we found another kind of brain signal that's more specific, that was quite helpful for distinguishing low versus high stickiness, and that is also the alpha band, but now how much the brain responds to flickering stimuli. So this is called a SSVEP, steady state visual evoked potential. This is basically a kind of special experiment where rather than just showing you normal stimuli like I did at the beginning of this talk, we make every stimulus flicker at a particular frequency. And the thing is, your brain is going to, if you're paying attention to that stimulus, your brain is going to resonate with that, as it were. So then when you're paying attention, your brain also flickers at that same frequency. So we made the stimulus flicker at 12.5 hertz. And when you would expect that when a person is paying attention, and their brain responds more at 12.5 hertz than when they're not paying attention. Interestingly enough, actually the mind wandering did not differentiate between low and high resonance with the stimulus, but stickiness did. So actually the stickiness is a more strong signal of how well a brain processes things than mind wandering. Or maybe people are better able to distinguish the stickiness of their mind than whether they're paying attention to the task or not, either one of those. So clearly, alpha waves are able to show us something about stickiness, even though still the accuracy of this distinction is relatively low. So another way that we started to look at stickiness was a much simpler measure. Sometimes we look for really complex things. We do complex experiments, as neuroscientists at least. And maybe it would be better to go for something simple. So we can also just track people's eyes while they're doing a task. In general, we know that when you're mind wandering, it's as if your eyes respond less to the stimuli. So normally, whenever you flash something, your eye will sort of expand and contract. It will have a so-called pupillary response. We also know that when you're mind wandering, your pupil responds less, as if it's sort of disconnected from this visual input. Now, interestingly enough, what I'm showing here is that when people have sticky thoughts, their pupil also responds less to stimuli than when people have non-sticky thoughts. So it's as if when you're in a sticky mind state, you're really in your head and you don't really connect to the outside environment. And we see that quite clearly, well, and actually in both the EEG and the eye tracking, but the eye tracking is much more direct and much more simple. So I think both these EEG and especially the eye tracking are quite good ways to measure the stickiness of the thoughts. Other things that we are currently pursuing in my lab are also seeing how the stickiness of the thoughts co-varies with how much they're self-related and how much they are negative in valence versus positive in valence. So we know, for example, that one of the most effective ways to evoke sticky thoughts is to make people do a task where they're asked to make self-relevant judgments. Then the amount of sticky thinking increases. It's quite interesting. Okay, so then the last part of my talk is how might contemplative practices reduce sticky thinking? So in my lab, we're also in the thick of this. So all of this is going to be quite preliminary. But anyway, I just wanted to share some of my thoughts and ideas about this. And then maybe there will be a chance to discuss more about it and also get your ideas. So one of the things that we're currently engaged in is doing a clinical trial where we're comparing the effects of mindfulness and fantasizing. Fantasizing might seem really, really weird. But actually, fantasizing is part of an intervention called preventative cognitive therapy, which is quite useful for preventing depressive relapse. And fantasizing, you could say it's also in a way a contemplative practice. It's more like visualization. So in fantasizing, in this sense, in this intervention, what people do is they fantasize about what it would be like if everybody liked them, or what it would be like if they were maybe rich, or they were pretty, whatever is the thing that concerns them, bothers them most about themselves. So there's this measurement instrument called the dysfunctional attitude scale, and people indicate like what is their, how what is their most dysfunctional attitude, and then you can sort of turn that around and use that to create a more positive sort of the opposite of that dysfunctional attitude, and the opposite of that way of thinking about themselves. And so you have people visualize this, and this is apparently helpful, maybe because people with depression find it really difficult to think about things positively, and especially about themselves positively. So here they're in a way forced to do it. And then, of course, mindfulness. Well, next week in the talk by Willem Kooijken, we'll also hear more about the effects of mindfulness, but mindfulness and mindfulness-based cognitive therapy are quite helpful instruments to reduce depression and especially reduce relapse. But it's very interesting. Both are used to reduce depressive thinking, but both probably do so in different ways, which is why we wanted to study them, because they probably use different mechanisms. Mindfulness is probably helping a person to become more friendly with their thoughts, but not really change the thoughts. Whereas in this fantasizing intervention, you're just increasing people's positive thoughts, but you're not changing their attitude to their thoughts more generally. And actually, that is kind of what these results show. So what we're looking at here are the results from one component of the study. So this is a massive study where we're doing EEG. We're having people wear a heart rate monitor for 24 hours. We're measuring sleep. We're having them do a mind-wandering kind of task. We're having them do an emotion regulation task. I'm not going to show you any of that. We're still also working on a lot of the analyses. But what I'm looking at here is where we're asking them during the intervention periods, we're asking them to 10 times a day about their thoughts and emotions at that moment. So this is called experience sampling or ecological momentary assessment, because it's ecological since it's about the thoughts that occur just in everyday life, not in the lab. And so there are 7 days that they followed either the mindfulness or the fantasizing intervention. By the way, every participant in our study gets to do both fantasizing and mindfulness. Some of them do mindfulness first, and then they wait a month, and then they do fantasizing, and some do the other way around. And then, they do this for 7 days. So first they get a session with a trainer, which is, well, the session is online, but it's a personal trainer. It's an actual person that talks to them and teaches them about mindfulness or fantasizing. And then they get an app with which they can do a practice every day for a whole week. And so we know from the app whether they do the practice. And then in another app, they get asked these questions about their thoughts during the week. So this is the whole week. They start here at 0 with the intervention, and then they practice hopefully every day until the end of the week. 10 times a day, we're asking them about things like rumination and positive affect. Well, actually very specific emotions, and then we add them up to positive affect score, as people generally do in psychology. And what's interesting is we're looking here at the difference between fantasizing and mindfulness. So fantasizing and mindfulness are both useful for dealing with depression, but probably differently. Probably fantasizing helps you to increase your positive thoughts, but not really change the way you engage with your own thoughts. Whereas mindfulness probably helps you deal with your thoughts and maybe get less stuck in rumination and sticky thinking, but probably doesn't really change much about the amount of positive thoughts in the beginning, at least. And here, that's exactly what we see. So if we subtract fantasizing and mindfulness, we can see that mindfulness sort of after fantasizing, there is rumination is higher than after mindfulness, especially, well, I guess both of them, the rumination is relatively low right after the intervention, but it increases for fantasizing, but not for mindfulness, as if the mindfulness helps you to avoid the rumination, avoid the getting stuck in thoughts. On the other hand, the fantasizing helps you to increase your positive affect, but not really change the amount of rumination. So this is what we see here. So that's just one aspect of the data. We're still looking at more stuff, but I think it's really interesting data. The other kind of practice that might really help us deal with stickiness is maybe one that you're less familiar with, but I love to talk about, which is what these guys are doing here in Sarajay Monastery in India, which is called monastic debate. And monastic debate is accompanied by analytical meditation, and it's a really disciplined investigation of Buddhist philosophy and probably just more generally beliefs about the world. So in the past, well, I guess since 2015, so that's already past 7 years, I've been talking to the monks here at Sarajay and trying to come up with ways to study scientifically. I'm not going to talk about the full scale of the study. I've done so elsewhere. For example, I've been talking a little bit about this in the recent event we had this summer with Mingyu Rinpoche. But I'm just going to show you one aspect of the data which might be relevant to stickiness. We didn't actually investigate stickiness very directly, but I mean, some data might be relevant to it. Before we're going to go into that, let me actually show you what this looks like in real life. Well, in sort of the lab in the science center where we're doing our experiments. So you can see here 2 monks wearing EEG caps. So we're measuring their brainwaves, and we're going to hear them debating with each other. So let me show you a little bit. And I'm going to count down for the synchronizing of the EEG with the video. So that's what you'll start by hearing. And then I'll show you a bit of the beginning of the debate where you can see just the mechanics of it. And then also show you a bit of the end where they get really excited. 3, 2, 1.
Ya, dah main batas, dah tadi di zawal dia, ya, syukur lagi ya, zawal tadi. Zawal. Ah, zawal main batas, zawal tiga sus. Ya, dah tu sudah zawal tiga sus. Ya, oh, tobat dia main bisa. Tobat dia apa? Tobat dia main batas, zawal tiga. Ya, tobat dia tu bisa. Ya, Kishna.
네 가서다.
알았어.
빨리 나갔으면 되더라.
예. 누구 이래다가 아주 야 누구 누가 니한테 그냥 누구 뒤에 주지 야 누구한테 내스 누구 내가 누구한테 야 내스 많이 있어 어 내스 좋아 누구한테 내스 이거 나올 것 같아 누구 내가 누구한테 내가 이거 봤다 제가 시장분들 누구 내가 야 누구한테 내가 이제 쳐요 누구한테 내가 이제 어야
Okay, you can tell it gets quite exciting. I could watch this forever, but let's continue with the talk for a moment. So what they're doing here is one thing you might notice is that the one who's sitting is not saying very much, and the one who's standing is saying a lot. The one who's sitting is called the defender, and his job, and by the way, nuns can debate too, but here so far we've been collaborating just with Sarah J. Monastery to really build a solid relationship. But the one who's sitting is required to hold a consistent position, because the name of the game of this kind of debating is to find out what is consistent, to find out, like, if you take a particular standpoint position, what is that consistent with? So it doesn't really is not about convincing somebody else of your point, even though they might look quite aggressive, like you have to agree with me. No, it's not about agreeing. It's really collaboratively about trying to find out, you know, if you take this position, what does that, what is consistent with that position and what is inconsistent with that position. For example, one of the main things they might be investigating is something about impermanence, because that's a fundamental Buddhist truth. And the weird thing is that we as humans, if we think about it, we know that the world is quite impermanent. But if you look at how we act, we actually tend to act as if the world is quite permanent. And, you know, climate change is a great example. It's like we're very good at ignoring all of those things. So that is very, very roughly, that's what they're doing. So this one who's seated has to hold a consistent position. The one who's standing is called a challenger, and he's going to do everything in his power to try to get the one who's seated, the defender, to agree to something inconsistent. So he's going to play all kinds of tricks. He's going to use all kinds of logic to find this out. And I think there's a lot of things that are going on here that might help you reduce the stickiness of your mind. For one thing, it helps you to see things from many different perspectives, because you have to react to maybe crazy ideas and really try to say, okay, what's the logic here? And can I go with this logic, or does this not make sense? And is there a way that maybe it could be not true, or that I could see it in a different way? So it makes you question. And the other thing is maybe not one that's put forward by the tradition, but as an outsider, what I see is that the monks here are actually encouraged by their teachers to act aggressively, act arrogantly. That's not what they're allowed to do anywhere else, but in the debate playground, you could say. And in this way, they practice acting out emotions. But if you're a defender, you get angry, you're screwed, because you can't have logic while you're angry. So you have to figure out a way to maintain a balance and remain calm, even when somebody is yelling at you and shouting at you and all of that fun stuff. So if you get into, therefore, a sticky mind, which I also have shown in other work, that tends to be especially evoked when the ego, the self, tends to be attacked and provoked, then you're screwed. So they figure out some ways to probably reduce the sticky minds. Well, we haven't shown that. One of the things we've shown is that it seems like the more experienced monks are, the more they show brain waves that are associated with attentional absorption and focus, So this here we see frontal theta brainwaves, which are really normally enhanced when the person is really focused on something and not mind wandering. And you tend to see that during the debate, especially in blue for the experienced monks, and especially at the end of the debate. So they really zone in. Also, when this is some newer data that hopefully we'll get to publish soon, if we just count how many attention and how many distraction moments there are for more experienced monks on the left and less experienced monks on the right, here what we visually have represented is gray distraction and blue attention. So you can see that monks with more experience have way more attention and way less distraction than monks with less experience. This is just from an external observer perspective. But you can also see that change in the alpha power in the brain. So yeah, that's just a little bit of data we have on this. We also looked at self-reported emotions and negative affect, and you do see that even during the pandemic, monks with more experience reported much less negative affect than monks with low experience. So yeah, these are just, again, some very beginning kind of findings, but I think there is something there, or there's a lot there to be further investigated. But I think roughly my time is up, so I just want to finish here and have some time for your questions. So just to remind you what I talked about, I began by saying that mind wandering occurs half of the time. Mind wandering is completely fine and actually quite healthy, but it can become harmful when it becomes sticky, or especially when it becomes ruminative. Sticky thinking can be detected with this EEG signal called this steady state visual evoked potential in the alpha band, as well as eye tracking. There is some very early data suggesting that contemplative practices may help to reduce mind wandering, and especially this sort of ruminative thinking, but a lot more research needs to be done there. So that's all from me today. So time for questions.
Thank you very much, Marieke. Thanks for sharing this research you have been conducting for how many years now?
Well, I guess it's just a collection of all kinds of different projects for some of the earliest data, I guess, from probably like 8 years ago or so, and yeah, some more recent.
Yeah, and while waiting for some questions that would come from our friends here, please think about it. I was wondering, you mentioned that there may be some questions that you still need to consider or do more research on. What questions are you investigating still at this point, and what is not clear from the research yet?
Well, I guess a ton. So I guess what I mentioned at the end, the study we're doing with the mindfulness versus fantasizing. So a lot about how interventions might affect this sticky thinking. There's a lot to be done there, and actually the strands of work on how to measure sticky thinking were kind of in parallel with the conducting the studies in the effects of mindfulness and also monastic debate. So we haven't quite used the sticky thinking measures in, for example, the debate study, and also with research with the Tibetan monks, we're now really thinking a lot about the question of what are good measures for this particular context, because like the kind of task that I showed you at the beginning of my talk, and that we use a lot in the West, it's really made for Western people. We've tried running this with Tibetan monks. They understand the task, but it's not intuitive to them, which then means that actually the task becomes a different kind of task, and it probably measures different things. We've now come to the conclusion that most of these tasks measure how much Western style education you've had, because interestingly, some monks that we meet have had a lot of Western style education. They've gone to Indian schools that follow the Western model, and some of them have come to the monastery from being a peasant in Tibet, with obviously a very different kind of education and different way of thinking. And a lot of what cognitive neuroscience is about is really based on the Western kind of experience. So yeah, I think there's a lot there to be figured out, like how can we develop kind of tasks that are more grounded in people's experience in the relevant culture that we're studying.
And that's very interesting. Thank you. Maybe we can stop your screen sharing and come back to the main room altogether and see each other. Thank you. That's nice. And I can see Marcia Handler, if I pronounce your name well. You are raising your hand, so the floor is yours.
Yes. Thank you. First of all, thank you very much. Thank you for the lecture. It was really, really interesting. My question, I would say, is basic, but nonetheless, I'd like to ask it. You said at the beginning that our mind wanders 50% of the time, right? And I guess that's the percentage is related to how much is the sticky thinking. Is it really sticky or not, I guess? And my question would be, so after all the conclusions, can we say that maybe after practicing mindfulness or other contemplative practices, can we reduce the percentage? Can we go like from 50 to maybe 20% of mind wandering? And do you see that in professional practitioners?
Great questions. Thank you so much, Marcia. So I would say that there is been, like, I think one study that's looked at the effects of a short mindfulness intervention on mind wandering in college students. We found a bit of a reduction of mind wandering after this intervention. Having said that, I'm not necessarily expecting all mindfulness practices to reduce the amount of mind wandering, because I think a lot of meditation practices are also not about reducing mind wandering. They're about becoming aware of the mind wandering that's occurring, but also being okay with it. So maybe, I mean, one reason why I started to work on trying to track mind wandering continuously with like EEG or eye tracking is that one of my working hypotheses, based on my own experience again, is that the mind wandering might become shorter in duration after you've been practicing. And maybe this also depends on the kind of practices you do, because some practices, maybe especially the what are called the focused attention practices, the real where you play maybe close attention to your breath or something like that, maybe they are for reducing the amount of mind wandering. But many other practices, like more open monitoring kind of practices, it's not about reducing the amount of mind wandering, but when just noticing whenever it occurs, and then just sometimes not even doing anything, but just if you're aware of it, then the mind wandering will sort of reduce by itself. But then what does change is the stickiness of it, which might probably reduce also the duration of it, but also how far it pulls you away from your connection with the environment and things. So I think actually, to come back to Gabor's question of, what's next, one also really interesting study I would love to do is compare different kinds of contemplative practices in the same people. I mean, it's really, really hard to do because it's hard to get grants where you can follow people for multiple years. And that's the kind of thing we need, because this is not something that is probably going to change within a week or two. It would probably change over years, and it's just really, really, really hard to get funding for multiple years, and also find people that are willing to do such experiments, right? To be controlled practitioners of a particular kind of type. So yeah, but I think that's where some of that occurs. And again, I would also say that I probably not even recommend practices, meditation practices that would really reduce the amount of mind wandering. I would really because if you don't have mind wandering, you're also lacking this kind of creativity. I mean, mind wandering is very healthy because you're also making use of the time. Like if you're doing such a boring task, it's actually, I think, a very good sign when somebody starts thinking about other stuff, because, you know, it's so stupid. Like it's better to think about what there's one person I met at some of the Mind and Life summer research institutes in America called David Meyer. And he would say, you know, people are thinking about the task of life. It's not like mind wandering is necessarily bad. It's actually probably really good because you're thinking about the task of life rather than the stupid thing that the experimenter wants you to do. So yeah, those are some of my thoughts. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for the question, Marcia. Are you okay with the answer or any further? Yeah, good. Before Ruben, I saw Father Francis Tizo's post in the chat. If you are here, Father Francis, and can speak, you may want to raise your question live yourself.
Yes, hi, Marieke. Actually, this is very similar to what we were just talking about, so perhaps we could move ahead. The only point that I was trying to make here is that the skill to develop is not the suppression of distraction, but the flexibility, right? To enhance the flexibility in the return to focus. And I think that that's what we seem to be seeing in some kinds of, you know, mindfulness training over long periods of time, that people become more flexible in returning to the task. And of course, I was thinking for a moment there, well, if people if it's healthy to rebel against the task, maybe the problem is the context of the task.
Yeah.
Because after all, your whole life is not going to be spent in the laboratory, unless, of course, you want to be 100% in the laboratory. But anyway, great research, and thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think this is also why I'm asking this question, like how difficult was it to disengage from the thought to measure the stickiness? Because I think that's almost the more interesting question to ask, not so much how well they're able to direct their attention to something quite arbitrary as the task. And actually, the concept of a task is even most of the time in our lives quite unclear. Because I only realized this when I was participating in kind of an online experiment by Jérôme Sacour from the École Normale Supérieure, and he had this sort of mind wandering in the real world experiment, and then you got a prompt from your phone every so often asking you about your mind wandering at that particular moment. And then, you know, you're asking, are you paying attention to your task at, you know, random moments in life? And then I was like, I'm not sure what my task is at that particular moment. So how do I know whether I'm paying attention to the task? But yeah. And actually, I think another thing that would be worth investigating that is worth mentioning maybe is I would have the strong hypothesis that with kind of training in these in different kinds of mindfulness or meditation practices that are about directing your attention, you would also probably start to have more coherence between the subjective measures of where your attention is focused, so like by answering these thought probes, and the objective measures, for example, the EEG. And there's a little bit of evidence for this from, interestingly enough, brain-computer interface studies. Well, there's exactly one study, which is why I think it's a little bit of evidence, but they found actually that it was easier to train a brain-computer interface for people who had experience with mindfulness. And I think it's because they know better maybe where their mind is, so that it's the mental patterns associated with different mental states are easier to distinguish for the computer. And so that would be, again, also a testable hypothesis that would be quite interesting.
Thanks. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Father Francis. Ruben, you are now logged in with another device.
Yes, thank you, Gabor. Just a question about stickiness and how to measure it. I suppose are there different ways of measuring this notion, and also how to conceptualize it? Kind of how much do we know about the phenomenology, or how, I don't know. Just wondering.
Yeah. So, well, I think in this talk, I've presented you with some ideas. I mean, one way to measure the stickiness of thought is just to ask people at this moment how difficult it is it to disengage from the thought, which seems to work reasonably well. At least people's judgments are coherent with what we can measure in terms of objective data. But of course, you cannot measure that all the time. You can only measure that at most once a minute. So you don't get a lot of data. So that's a bit of a problem there. You can measure these objective measures like alpha waves or pupil size, which I've also indicated in my talk. But the problem is that pupil size and alpha waves are also affected by other factors than just the stickiness of the thought. So there's not like a pure objective measure of the stickiness of the thoughts. I think Richie Davidson has also been working on something that I think is similar, which is how much does, like, for example, they showed people disturbing stimuli and evoking emotions, and then they looked at how long does the amygdala still respond, things like that. But that, of course, only works when you show these disturbing stimuli and when you can put somebody in an fMRI scanner, which is also not that convenient. So I think there's lots of imperfect ways to measure stickiness. So also my journey is still continuing. I'm quite happy with this, and it works reasonably well for the kind of situations I've been working on. But for example, in the study with the Tibetan monks, I still have to figure something out because I think those Western lab-based measures might not be the best way to go. So we had, and also even the emotion questionnaires, we spent hours and hours trying to figure out how to translate the Western standardized questionnaires into Tibetan. Like, what do we really mean with these kind of emotions? And we're still not quite happy with the translation. And so it's very hard. As well, probably with measuring anything, you always have to go back again and ask yourself, like, is this really measuring what we're measuring? And in some way, maybe also stickiness is, well, some psychologists call it also, I think, cognitive reactivity. It's related at least to stickiness. And so there's questionnaire measures of that, but people are also not always very good at indicating on a questionnaire like what their score would be. You could also just literally ask them to do more of a microphenomenological study. Actually, that's also one of the things I would love to do, is to see how the ratings of the stickiness, how people get to these ratings. That was a very interesting idea by Claire Petit-Mangin that came up when I talked about this at the summer school this summer. So yeah, I still want to do it if there's a suitable student that has the expertise on this. But then maybe we can come up with better questions to ask. Yeah, so there's lots of considerations there. Sorry, this is not probably a really clear answer, but it shows you maybe more of the struggle that I'm having, that I have a sense there's something there to measure, but it's hard to figure out how to get it.
Thank you, Ruben, and thanks, Marieke, for the answer. Annie Bloch.
Yes, this raises some questions about the vocabulary, because we're talking about wandering. In French, I'm thinking about the word rêverie, and rêverie is something which has been there's a theory and the experimentation of rêverie by the French philosopher Bachelard, and it would be interesting to look into that. Also, I've been thinking about free association. How do you relate free association with, wandering? And in my own experience, I don't know, there's some inner intelligence operating within mind wandering. Not all the time, but still. This is my own observation. And it's not stickiness, something completely different, but it's one modality of mind wandering.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah, thank you very much, Annie. That's also one of the debates that's been going on in the mind wandering literature about actually what do we mean with mind wandering. And Kalina Christoph, whom I mentioned before, she's one of the seminal people in this field, and she's been arguing that actually mind wandering is only mind wandering when it's, I think that what you mean with rêverie, I think in English we would call it daydreaming. It's really very almost perfectly flexible process that would really just go everywhere. Kalina Christoph uses these words like hither and thither, and it's really very free. And in a way that's completely non-sticky if we were to use that dimension of thoughts. And it's very different from like rumination, which Kalina Christoph says that's maximally constrained. And I'm using mind wandering to basically say anything that's not task related would be called mind wandering. And it could be this daydreaming, but it could also be rumination.
Yes, but to me, it relates not at all to mindfulness and shamatha and so on. It relates to Dzogchen because it relates to openness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Basically, it's a exploration and experience of openness, of emptiness.
Mm-hmm.
So if you kind of study it, reduce it to mindfulness, you're missing a lot of stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree. That's why I think that it's important to study, to look at different kind of contemplative practices. I mean, we started with mindfulness and also this fantasizing, which you could say is like a visualization practice, because it's used a lot in clinical practice. And this was also in collaboration with my clinical neuroscience colleague. But I think, yeah, looking at these Dzogchen practices, for example, is really, really interesting. And there I would still actually not expect necessarily a reduction in mind wandering, but maybe especially a reduction in stickiness. So in fact, that's why I thought that this was an interesting and important dimension to consider. Yeah,
I feel it's very interesting to have new words and new concepts appearing in these studies, the concept of wandering, of stickiness, and not a negative aspect of wandering. And what I've noticed also fantasizing. That's interesting. It's a new word into this universe. And myself, I've been thinking about not fantasizing, but the concept of simulation, which is a new word coming from the computer world. But somehow I feel myself, I'm not fantasizing. I'm doing simulation, which is also connected to the idea of thought experiment. But thought experiment could be static, whereas simulation is dynamic. And for me, simulation is a form of controlled mind wandering.
Yeah, absolutely.
So,
yeah.
And to me, this is very, very important, especially having a more positive view of the future and not being stuck in the present either, you see?
Yeah. Yeah, and this is why, for example, mind wandering has been related to creativity. And I think the reason is that I think the natural mode of our mind is to constantly, and there's this is not something I'm just making up, but there's some neuroscience evidence behind this. So actually, Kalina Christoph did a really interesting study of meditators where she put meditators in the scanner, and then she asked them to press a button whenever they realized they were they noticed they were mind wandering. And then they were looking at what happens right before people notice this. And then you can see that actually in the right before people start to conceptualize thoughts, that their hippocampus, which is a memory area, is quite active. So I think what the brain is constantly doing whenever you don't occupy it with a task, which is actually increasingly rare in our modern day society. It's actually very little time to just have open space without information inflow. But when you do let it, then the hippocampus just starts to retrieve memories and recombine them. And this is probably the source of creativity and new ideas, where existing concepts get recombined and reconfigured, and then you know, probably your dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is so what you see then in the brain is you first see the hippocampus and medial temporal lobe turn on, and then the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex turns on, as if it's judging the quality of the stuff that comes up, and only lets certain things pass through the surface, and other things just remain under the surface, whatever that means. Yeah, don't get continued as ideas.
Because it looks like there's some skills to be developed within the wandering, not the wandering mind, but the wandering process and activity. I think there are some skills to develop there.
Yeah. I mean, I think one skill is to become more aware of this process when it happens, and to, on the one hand, allow it to happen, but don't get too caught up in it, so that, you know, there's also real world examples of Kalina Christoph again tells this very powerful story of how she was once asked to testify in court because a woman had caused a traffic accident, since it was like the anniversary of her husband's passing, and she was just so wrapped up in the thoughts about his husband. I would call this an extremely sticky kind of thought, that she completely, her brain did not perceive the environment anymore, and didn't see, you know, a car coming from an unexpected direction and accident. So, you know, this is where it becomes maladaptive again. But it's his balance. Are
you investigating more this question of resonance? Because to me, this is really an interesting thing. You know, the phenomenon of resonance, bioresonance. You just pointed that, but.
Well, so I've been using this very limited kind of resonance, which is just how your brain responds to a stimulus that's flickering at a particular frequency, and I'm using that just as a tool. And actually, what's the problem with that is that because the stimulus is flickering, it creates quite a strong experience for a person, and it disrupts also the mind wandering process, it seems like. So it's actually not so useful and for these purposes, but it's quite interesting that our brain does tend to naturally latch onto flickering stimuli. Yeah, that just happens.
Thanks.
Thank you, Annie, for this nice dialogue. And we would have time for two more questions. One would be from Shakya. Actually, you made two comments in the chat. You may want to share both.
Yes. So first of all, good evening to everyone. I had one question and one sharing of experience just. So the question is about, I try to understand also what was the meaning of sticky thought, right? And I wrote down that it's how these are thought which is hard to disengage from. But if I reflect on myself, it's hard for me to understand how hard it could be for a thought to be disengaged from. Because, for example, if there's some stimuli which arise while I'm having a thought, then it happens. It feels like it happens quite naturally and instantly that I shift my attention to that other stimuli, and then another one, the stimuli B, C, D, E can come, and then my thought can just jump like the monkey mind, right? So I would say, oh, it's very easy to disengage from thoughts. So what would you mean when you say sticky thought is a thought which is hard to be disengaged from? And then I thought like, okay, but what I feel hard to be disengaged from is actually feelings. So maybe you mean thought which has an effect on that. For example, if I was to reflect on myself when you are very sad or when you are very happy, then in these cases, I find myself, okay, I can sense easiness or I mean, hardship level to be disengaged from such thought. But if it's just, you know, thought without any effect, then I don't get it how it could be it could be even thinkable that it might be hard to disengage from because it's so easy, it's so natural. Right? So that was my question.
Well, so I would say you're completely right. Probably most of the time it has to do with affect. It's just that maybe not all affect is necessarily difficult to disengage from. So, and I think the specific type that's difficult to disengage from what I know about the literature, tends to be the ones that are more ruminative in nature, which means they would be more self-relevant and self-evaluative especially, and probably also more associated with negative affect. So, you know, our brains are very useful, very smart, you know, or our minds are very smart. So whenever there's something that threatens the self, the mind will be like, okay, I got to pay attention to this because this is dangerous. So it's a natural response for it to then have to latch onto it, to be very sticky. So the second part of your question is, how do you determine how sticky it is? Personally, I think the trick is that you can use whatever you sense when you feel this question come on the screen, like how difficult is it to disengage from the thought? The moment you get this question, you have to disengage from the thoughts. And then you can check, like at that moment, how difficult was it? Do I feel like it was easy to switch to this, reading this question, or was it quite difficult?
But then my point is, if there's no effect, how if there is any differences, just intuitively, of course there's no proof, but intuitively the difference would be so small and minor that it would be very hard to, even for myself, tell whether or not it was easy, very easy, hard, very hard. So that's a point I was struggling. That's a concept that I'm personally struggling with to understand.
Yeah, no, and I haven't collected enough data, I think, on the stickiness to really say like how much it co-varies with affects, for example, or self-relatedness. I just would need more data to actually prove that. But yeah, it makes a lot of sense, your experience.
Okay, and I guess I need to comment on my sharing of experience too. So I had almost 10 years of Tibetan debate too, of experiences. Wow. And from what I can tell is that your abstract conceptualization capacity goes up very high. But it happens on topics that are not related on yourself. So again, coming back with this affect topic, because when you were talking about depression, right? Depression, rumination, it is often related with base of topic or base of qualities or default that are related to ourselves. For example, myself or my body or my nose or my my life, etc., etc., right? But when you do the debate from experience, you don't talk about my, but you talk about what that person said, or what it is, what a table is, or you take any type of example you could take yourself, but and during that process, you are not taken into consideration. So from my experience, because despite the fact that your capacity for abstract conceptualization go up, but everything dealing with your own internal struggle is not necessarily dealt with just with the debate. Of course, it helps, but yeah.
Yeah, I think it can be, but it depends on what you direct your debates to. So I've been learning a little bit of debate from some Western monks, especially, who've like translated the debate language in English. And we were, of course, more free because we could debate about anything. We debated about mind wandering, for example, and the science of that, which is fascinating. But also, we were playing around with our own perception and really going with our own experience. And I found that very powerful as a way to really develop your own thoughts. So maybe it also depends on exactly what you apply these methods to. Yeah.
Yes. So in the case of research, means that just the debate is not a direct cause for reduction of rumination. That's just a comment that my experience would bring forward. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool.
So thank you for your answers.
Thanks.
Thank you, Shakya. And the final question or comment is yours, Bruce.
Can you hear me? Am I unmuted?
Yes, we hear you well.
Okay, that's great. Well, first of all, thank you very much, Professor Van Vugt, for taking the time and trouble to come and bring us all this very interesting research. Right at the very start, you said there was no definition of mind wandering, and I think that's hugely important because my understanding of the mind wandering literature is that it is very messed up. It's very mixed. Part of the problem is that there are two different types of mindfulness in the literature, which have been running in parallel for some 35 or 40 years. There's the one which I think most of us here are familiar with, shall we say, Buddhist influenced mindfulness. And of course, there's Ellen Langer's work, which has been going on in parallel to this. And Ellen Langer's work, for those who perhaps are not as familiar with it, evolved out of her own work on mindlessness and choice. And her conceptual understanding of mindfulness predominantly from the viewpoint of information processing, the drawing of novel distinctions from perceptual input, which situates individuals in the present and promotes what she termed mindfulness. And this conceptualization is with the openness to information, flexibility in adopting different cognitive perspectives and concentrating on the current task, basically resembles the concept of creativity that we've been talking about. And there's considerable confusion in the literature. I've seen any number of papers who switch backwards and forwards between Ellen Langer's work and the work based on MBSR, MBCT, without appreciating that these are entirely different modes of using the word mindfulness. And of course, you're quite right to say that mind wandering as creativity is probably actually an extremely important and normal function of human lived experience. I think the focus on attention, which has come out of the Buddhist related thing, goes back to the early days when Kabat-Zinn introduced MBSR. The psychology community tried to find something that they recognized in their mechanistic view of the brain and hit on attention. And a lot of the early research was based on attention, and definitions of mindfulness were based on attention. So in a sort of twisted way, attention seemed to be the most important activity of the brain during mindfulness. Now, you've mentioned that mind wandering came into vogue around about 2010. And it was the work in about 2008 which demonstrated that the central executive attention network was just one of a number of prominent networks in the brain, and that other ones were called default mode network and salience network. The salience network obviously is where the emotional or the affective content comes in. And so my question to you, I mean, I found it fascinating that you were using EEG studies with the alpha rims, but how does your work relate to the fMRI network studies? As I say, you know, the neuroscience has characterized these brain networks as being identifiable, and basically has shown that you get, during cognitively demanding tasks requiring attention, you get consistently decreased activities in the default mode network and the salience network, which effectively become deactivated. But the reverse occurs when a perceptual input is recognized during a task, and here we come down to basic human survival instincts. Austin's wonderful slide, which I'm sure you've seen in Garrison, of the meditator and the saber-toothed tiger. If the meditator continues to sit and pay attention to the meditation and ignores the perceptual input of the approaching saber-toothed tiger by activating her default mode network and salience network to check from memory whether this is important, then her genes die out and the meditator doesn't survive. So I'm just wondering, how does your work integrate with the important switching between central executive?
Yeah. So
DSN.
Yeah, so well, just very briefly, in view of time, I would say in general, the default mode network has also been linked to these occipital alpha oscillations that are probably the most consistent relationship between in EEG with mind wandering. So that's entirely consistent. The reality is more complex, just like mindfulness is not the opposite of mind wandering, as we've discussed here, and is a common misunderstanding, as you also pointed out very correctly. Similarly, default mode network is not necessarily directly related to mind wandering. It's somewhat related, but the default mode network is also active, for example, with imagination of the future, which can be quite task related, and also these networks are not as anti-correlated as they were initially presented to be. So I think more recent research, especially from Jonathan Smallwood, who has been one of the pioneers in the mind wandering field, is now starting to nuance all these ideas a little bit. But you know, very briefly, the default mode network is also associated with occipital alpha, which is what I find as the most general relationship with mind wandering. But I think what we really need to do, and actually Johnny Smallwood has also been working on this, is drill down a little bit more into what we mean with mind wandering, what is the characterization of the thoughts. And also Johnny Smallwood has been finding that this default mode network is related to some notion of stickiness, although he calls it slightly differently. So yeah, thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. And on another day, I would love to talk to you more about classical ballet. And I do remember seeing you dance at Kimsey, which was a pleasure. And also about the whole concept of debating, which I have also had a chance to see in Tibet and Bhutan, and how this is a correlated perspective of different aspects, whether it's sticky when you retain an interest in the topic, whilst at the same time moving to different perspectives would be quite an interesting point to discuss at a future date. But thank you once again for today.
Thank you, Bruce, and thank you, Marieke, for your talk and for the questions and your answers as well. Thank you all for participating in today's MLE Friends webinar. It's always an intimate circle, but with a deep and engaging dialogue and discussions and questions. So thank you all for participating. And while I'm sharing my screen and announce our upcoming events, I would like to hand over the floor to you, Johanna, so that
Thank you. Thank you so much, Marieke, for your absolutely fascinating talk once again. And as you mentioned, next week, we're actually going to have Dr. Willem Koekjen here, who will be taking a different angle, but he'll be talking very much about sort of the history and the long arc of mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, and taking us through the story as it's been so far, and also what he sort of anticipates based on some of his latest research for the future. So for anyone who's interested in this general field, you're more than welcome to come. This is a public talk. It's part of the Mind Matters series. So if you know of anyone who's also interested in this, feel free to spread the word in your networks. And then the following day, so that'll be next Wednesday, September 21st at 6 p.m. And then the following day on September 22nd, also at 6 p.m., we are actually going to launch a new series called the EVA Alumni Series, and it will feature researchers who have received grants from the European Varela Awards program and who've completed their research project by now. And so we're inviting them back to share with the community a little bit about their actual research project, and also just the overall process of integrating contemplative science methods into the research through this very significant grant. So Dr. Terje Sparby will be talking about his project called First Person Methods in Contemplative Science, and microphenomenology, anthropophagy, and the stages of meditation. So we hope you can join us for both of these talks, which are public talks, and feel free once again to spread the word within your networks and invite others in your networks to become MLE Friends if they would be interested in talks like the one tonight. So thanks again so much, Marieke, for your time and for sharing these findings with us. And thanks to all of you for joining us as well. Have a good rest of the evening.
Thank you all. See you again next week.